Thanks for joining us back here for our 2 p.m. panel. The topic will be Smart Cities Are Connected Cities. That might sound like a no-brainer, but peeling that layer back of connectivity in our municipal environments is actually not that simple, but the rewards can be wildly advantageous. So before we get started, I'm going to invite each of our panelists to quickly introduce themselves. A minute or two, tell us about who you are, what you're doing here, and then we'll roll into the panel questions. We can start with Greg.
I'm Greg Dunn. I'm a telecommunications attorney with Ice Miller. We have an Internet of Things practice. We like to joke that at least my efforts involve the Internet and not the rest of the things. But I've worked in this field now for about 30 years. Did ORNET, the Ohio Academic Research Network's first IRUs into feasible right to use, their first leases. Did the double-link concept with Dana McDaniel, did the legal work for that. And then City of Columbus did their broadband plan back in 2007, which sort of has come to fruition with them being the winner of the Smart Cities.
My name is Rob Scott. I'm the Director of Mobile Strategy for Cincinnati Bell.
I didn't get to
So my team put together the Light Up Cincinnati initiative, which deployed Wi-Fi around and continues to deploy Wi-Fi around greater Cincinnati, northern Kentucky. We developed the Connect Cincinnati app that was the conduit at the time to get free Wi-Fi. And why am I here? Probably because wireless is probably the easiest part of the smart city thing. So if it were really difficult, Zach would not have invited me. That I'm sure of.
Rob's too humble.
Russ Middleton, co-founder and chief strategy officer at SmartLink, the kiosk that you guys kind of see when you walk in, trying to do the same thing here that Rob's been trying to do with connecting, bridging the digital divide, the Wi-Fi, but also big data and really user experience on the sidewalks.
I'm Jamie Sullivan with AT&T, part of our IoT solutions group, focused on bringing together 5G, smart cities, and this thing called FirstNet for public safety data network in this country, and focusing on really working with partners and the likes of utilities like a Cincinnati Bell, and really steering cities to rely on their utilities and those assets to really start the ground up build of smart city infrastructure.
So looking through the lens of connectivity, one of the conversations that I've been dialoguing with our Regional Council of Governments here, and in fact throughout the state, has been that we need to prioritize adding a layer of connectivity into our hard and soft infrastructure projects. In no particular order, can you give an example of a success story that is deploying that foundational layer of connectivity, really focusing on infrastructure projects for outcomes that fit within that realm of smart cities?
Well, I can think of a couple off the top of my head. City of Columbus, for example, whenever they do road or freeway resurfacing now, puts an 1.25 inch conduit in, which makes it very easy to blow fiber into, which is why they have so much fiber in Columbus. City of Gahanna did the same thing. They've done theirs more piecemeal over time, but they've got a reasonably robust fiber network that they built incrementally simply by working with the road people at the same time. So,
yeah, I think for us to this point, it's been a challenge in that, and it's been talked about in probably every other breakout session, but you have to get collaboration from so many different parties to move the ball forward, right? I mean, there's corporate America, there's government, there's the educational system, which is a big, that's one of the things that we've been able to solve for, because that tends to get a lot of attention, right? So whether it's the Newport City Schools Initiative or the Cincinnati Public Schools Initiative, those are the type of deployments that we've been more successful in because they have a measurable end result. So, but to get to that point, if you don't have that collaboration, which again, other folks have referred to it too. This has not been a 10 or 15-year-old business or industry to be in. It's really escalated or accelerated this last year. So that collaboration is probably the biggest thing that I think has started to improve, but 2 years ago really wasn't there. But the school benefits that we've been able to put together and the public accessibility of our broadband on the light up side has probably been our biggest soft implementations.
And when you reference light up, that includes, you're somewhere around 500 access points in the downtown core?
Yeah, closing in on 6. The BB&T Arena here is one of the more recent ones for the Inside Bowl, so that's an extension of light up as well. And then the app's probably around 125,000 downloads right now, and that incorporates in a lot of SMB to promote their offers and deals within that app.
So it really sounds that you guys are leading towards the idea that you can develop this network and then other people will be able to deploy solutions on top of it.
Yeah, I think we're completely open to it. We've had roaming interest from kiosk vendors, from other wholesalers because I think you know if you look at what do you do with the wireless thing, I was kind of playing it down, but if you can't move the data to a central location and create an action, then what is the data worth in some ways, right?
Right. Well, I think when we talk about connecting a city, we're talking about connecting our people, our places, our things, and our data or our information. Jamie, I want to ask you a question. And when we were speaking on the panel together in Toledo, the question was asked as it related to the Cleveland lighting RFP. And the question was something along the lines of, should Cleveland include smart and connected solutions in their lighting RFP? My answer was, well, I don't think they can afford not to. Your answer was a little bit more in-depth, and I think spoke to the challenges that we are looking at as we're creating these mesh networks. So there's cellular, 4G, 5G, there is Wi-Fi, and there is ultra-narrowband. Can you speak a little bit to the importance of creating a mesh network and the successes that you guys are seeing or the challenges that you're seeing in trying to do that?
Yeah, so I think cities and utilities have an opportunity to repurpose a lot of their aging infrastructure. And there's a lot of things that are coming along, and to your original question, you know, we have the ability to build networks within networks with software definition and virtual functions of boxes and machines now. So if cities don't start to take advantage of those opportunities and working with the folks who have to invest in the assets, they're going to miss a huge opportunity to really upgrade their infrastructure and upgrade the services that they can provide their citizens. Having redundancy and a lot of these things built in, everything's IP. I mean, networks can talk to networks. You're seeing what public safety is doing in this country. They're moving away from, isolated and proprietary radio systems. Everybody's going to be starting to move to carrier technology, IP backbones, whether it's on a fixed wireline or a wireless connectivity. The services you get in your home, probably 10 years from now, you won't have a coax cable coming into your house anymore. You'll be getting it all through an over-the-air wireless connection. So the ability now as the carriers start to take advantage of building out because of what's coming with 5G, some of the things we're doing with FirstNet now on the public safety side of things, there's a huge opportunity to cities to take advantage and get on board. The ones that do that will be better positioned for the long haul. The ones that don't are going to be playing catch up.
So Russ, I want to thank you, Jamie. I want to ask you a question because you've been deeply involved with the SmartLink efforts in Newport and around the country. What is the sentiment as someone that is a solution provider that has an embedded interest in genuinely defeating the digital divide? What have been your challenges in standing up that business model that has a duality in its purpose? So yes, you have a business, but you're also solving a community issue.
Right. So, I mean, yes, you have to make money, right, to stay in business, and so the successes are happening in a lot of places that are having high foot traffic areas, right? So for me, when you talk about a challenge, the biggest challenge is how do we, get that ROI in the areas that maybe don't have the same demographics, but that's really like, to us, that's the biggest piece and the missing piece of the puzzle.
So it's, listening to what Jamie said and then what you said, it sounds like there are always ways that we can cut costs or create value or simply generate revenue. And then we can take that funding pool and then create a more connected environment in our neighborhoods or cities or regions.
Exactly. So, I mean, what's great, and so when it comes back to the success story, every single kiosk that we put out to me is a success story because we are a paying tenant to an ISP, right, to justify the cost of building out that fiber network to get to our kiosk. And every single business or every single person that is in line with that, the cost is drastically reduced, for those internet services, because now it's right there, it's right across the street, right? So the more kiosks that we can build out within a city, and the farther away we can go from an ISP, right, the more tenants that are, potentially that are going to be able to reduce cost.
Right. So it seems like there's an unquestionable amount of alignment around the fact that the foundational layer of smart cities is connectivity. But there is a lot of tension around the legislation that is driving forward these conversations, specifically in cellular, specifically in rights of way. And those domains go on. I'd like to try to go down the row, and Greg, maybe we can start with you. Can you speak to some of the policy challenges or policy opportunities that are coming to fruition?
In full disclosure here, I'm representing 50 cities who have sued the state of Ohio on the right-of-way micro wireless bill, so far successfully. The policy issues, I mean, the conflict is these cities want the infrastructure in place. They need it for all the reasons we've talked about here. The question then becomes, well, how do you use municipal right-of-way and municipal property, the light stanchions, the poles, those sorts of things? How do you let the companies get on that, and what are the rules of that? And I'll give you an example. I mean, it's not an exaggeration. Theoretically, under the old bill, you could put a 50-foot tower in a residential neighborhood in somebody's front yard in the right-of-way. So obviously, that's not a desirable outcome from a municipal perspective, although it'll get good wireless into the neighborhood. So what we're trying to do is balance those interests of the cities with the interest to get this infrastructure in place. And the good news here is I think there's a lot of discussion going on at the State House now in Ohio about a new bill that'll hopefully balance those interests.
So, Jamie, I think I have to give you the opportunity to respond maybe, but certainly share your view on what it is that you're doing and how that is approaching the policy conversation in certainly a unique fashion. Love it or hate it, AT&T is certainly making waves with things like FirstNet, and you have good supporters, you have a lot of opposition, but in your mind, what are you guys accomplishing, and why is all of that worth it to AT&T?
Yeah, so in full disclosure, my company's probably on the opposite side of where Greg has been representing.
Yeah, talking to your lawyers.
Yeah. So
I thought it was important to go right to you after.
Yeah, no. But ironically, we actually agree with, our lawyers might take a different stand, but those of us who are operational actually agree with a lot of what probably Greg represents and what the cities represent. We don't want to come in and put towers in people's front yards that don't want that, and that's really not what the bill was for. It was a good idea in the sense of creating affordable access to get gigabit broadband into communities that would really benefit from it. Unfortunately, some bad apples and bad players went around and started taking advantage of the opportunity and kind of ruined it for everybody else. So the new bill hopefully will address all those kinds of things, because what it will enable is a lot of economic development in terms of enabling startups and incubators and those kinds of things that we really want to be a generator for. We don't, any of the communities we go into, we try to sit down with the city leaders that will talk to us and discuss where those are going to go. We've actually made overtures to cities to tell us where you want it to go. And some cities are responsive, some aren't. And it's unfortunate, because those folks are representing people of specific states and that, but there's an opportunity to kind of find middle ground, but unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't always get there. It was the right idea, but just a bad opportunity to try and put something in place that didn't really work. But I'm glad it's actually getting fixed, and we'll come back around to it and do it the right way.
So as we talk about laying down again this foundational layer, one of the conversations that continues to come up today is advanced and autonomous transportation. And while I am absolutely a transportation geek, I think that we are a very long way away from a technological and interoperability standpoint. What types of wireless solutions can help us compress the time to realizing advanced and autonomous transportation, not only in our city cores where we might have advanced mobility corridors, but extending out beyond our municipal boundaries into suburban and rural areas? How can we use our wireless connectivity solutions and expanded networks to enable that?
Go first. The state of Ohio is putting together a fiber run between Columbus, actually between Dublin and the Transportation Research Center up in north of Marysville, near the Honda plant. They're putting fiber optic up the freeway, looping it back, and putting these DSRCs, which were referenced in the last, the short-range radio communications devices. And seemingly that model could be expanded deeper into Ohio on freeways where you would have fiber on the freeway with more of these. They're really little cell towers, is what they are. And the one thought I've had is that, you could commercialize them too. I mean, they could also, because they talk on different frequencies. The one frequency could be talking to the vehicles and getting the road, communications. And yet the companies like AT&T could be providing the commercial applications over the top. So I think the state and states may want to look at that sort of model to get communications deeper and also to help this autonomous vehicle thing.
Yeah, I don't know if this will really answer the question, but I think when you look at, I guess if you ask 10 people what 5G is, you probably get 10 different answers. But at the end of the day, it's more deployment. It's kind of almost backwards because you need more wire in the ground to deploy more nodes, right? However you look at that and who owns those assets. Typically, it's power companies or cable companies. But to your point, this has to go far beyond the city core. And to do that, it's going to take money, and so I'm kind of scared when I think of autonomous vehicles today, in that if the cell coverage stops at a certain point, then does the vehicle just veer off the road? I mean, I don't know, but I'm 52, so I'm hoping that it'll be figured out in the next 20 years, so I can still go to Halloween in Athens and not have to drive there.
So I think both of you guys are, you're hitting it right on the head there. One, it's the connectivity piece, right? Everything has got to be able to communicate. Everything needs to be connected, and then it's the standard, right? It's the language that everyone can speak together. It's that the street and the light and the car with the other car, they are, it's going to have to be some type of standard that in some type of language. I look at it kind of like we do a smart home. You have to have that hub, right? There's Z-Wave technologies that correlate with the lights. There's Zigbee, and all these actually, integrate into one central management that has that language that can then speak out. So I think really what's missing, and I think that's something that we're trying to help build with the kiosk, is some type of hub, right, that can help everything communicate together to make those decisions and move forward.
So how do we give our smaller and medium-sized communities the ability to realize smart city success stories if they, say, don't have the buying power or the political sway to get state or federal funding that some of the larger cities have? How can we give those communities the tools to be successful in this space?
It's a great example of how utilities and the infrastructure players can come in and with, some help from some regulation and the Utilities Commission to be able to start to offer the technology as a service. So smaller communities that can't afford to build out their own NOCs and infrastructure, then they can have utilities that are operating from a regional standpoint, build a lot of this infrastructure, and then provide those kinds of things as a service to the municipalities, who will continue to get the best-in-class services while taxpayers are paying for a lot of the infrastructure that will go in, because it's going to improve the region and ultimately it's going to improve economic development. So it hopefully is a good investment.
That is a deep question you asked. It's an important one. I've been wrestling with it for about 30 years. The density issue makes it so hard to deploy into a rural and small town America. It just does. I mean, the companies can't get the rate of return. I remember Actually, a fellow worked for, was Ameritech at the time, joking that there was more business to be had in the Huntington Bank building in downtown Columbus than in McConnellsville, Ohio. And it's just true. So without the densities, it's tough. And having said that, I'm beginning to believe there's going to have to be some subsidization of rural area connectivity. That is just going to have to happen, because I just can't see a business model working that connects, that gets them connected.
Well, I know that AT&T is working on the white space project, or the rural connectivity project, excuse me. Microsoft is working on a white space project. So I think there are efforts out there, but I think that it's not a fully baked solution. So I do think that there are solutions that can make it happen, but they might require subsidies. So that's an interesting way to look at it. You know, Jamie, you also made an interesting point that by regionalizing these efforts, you can give these smaller communities the same buying power that a larger city has. But it requires that, you know, back to what Rob highlighted, it requires collaboration in that connectivity. And you know, it's interesting to veer down this path in this conversation because it's quite timely. In Ohio and of course in Kentucky and Indiana, we're trying to connect all of our people in our suburbs and in our rural areas, but we still haven't connected everybody in our urban cores. So one of the things that I think is a natural outcome of building a smart city is creating a more interconnected ecosystem between our stakeholders in our rural, suburban, and urban cores. And whether that is being able to work remotely because now you have access to high-speed internet, or being able to open up an app and understand that you can hop on a bus and then get to a new place of work. All of this stuff requires connectivity. And I'd like to transition a little bit, as the state of Ohio is not very quiet about making a statewide effort behind rural connectivity. Where do you think those trends are heading? And you mentioned earlier that it's going to require investment. Who is going to pay for that? Is it going to be public-private partnerships? Is it going to be a new municipal financing model? Where do you see that going if we know that inevitably we have to connect all of our people?
Another tough one. First off, the public-private model's probably the best in that government can do either at the local or state level. Building infrastructure isn't that hard. Building fiber optics isn't that hard. What is hard is operating the networks, where you need the expertise of communications companies and companies that are in that space. That's a very difficult thing for cities to do. So, I mean, I see public-private partnerships. I also see bonding being the two ways to go at this, perhaps using the bonding to get the infrastructure out, and then public-private partnering, who operates the infrastructure, so the companies that know how to do it can do it. Then the other thing is, and there is a lot of discussion of when you build the infrastructure, of opening it up to multiple providers at the same time. You don't have to just have one operator, especially when you're dealing with fiber. You could, have half a dozen fiber to one company and 32 to the other one, and whatever. There's also a revenue stream here once you get it out, which is leasing this to providers, companies that will provide services. So, but it's all very complicated, and it's kind of difficult to put together, because you have to take into account your legal situation, what the rights of the cities are, what the rights of the companies are, and ultimately have payback to whoever puts up the money.
It seems to me that, and you mentioned it there, most of, if not all of these solutions have a business model baked in. So it's not that these solutions can't eventually become self-sustaining, it's that we don't have the capital to upfront that build. And I think it's a fair statement to say that politicians are very risk adverse, especially as we're talking about some of these connectivity solutions, especially when they're using taxpayer dollars. So what have been some of your successful approaches? And maybe we started with Jamie and we head down this way on the row. What have been your successful approaches in getting governments to play ball, to focus on public-private partnerships, or maybe even cost sharing in initial deployments?
Well, I think from a smart city perspective, there's a couple of places we've had some success with that, and Atlanta being one, San Diego being another, where it's a partnership between a city, a utility, and some big technology vendors. I know in government they tend to like to split up services amongst a number of different vendors to kind of keep everybody honest. But there's at some point there's an opportunity for government to really take advantage of these public-private partnerships, but it's going, in some instances, is going to force them to select a single vendor to work with, or a single utility or infrastructure partner. There is a lot of services that can be transitioned into a model that would enable some of these governments to actually get a lot of these services for less than what they pay today. The challenge is getting the right folks in those positions who are willing to work with, getting a little bit more lenient with some of the regulations, and creating a little bit more of a business-friendly environment for some of these things to happen. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on where you are and what's the driving need.
So we've taken the same approach that, to the people that I look up to. I mean, just being in the tech industry big time. I mean, Sergey, what he did with Google and what Mark did with Facebook, their entire business model, what they actually, the value proposition that they have is a completely free service, right? Google, it's free for everyone. But look how much, look at the revenue numbers. They're top 10 companies in the world. Facebook, the same thing. It's free for any of us to sign up. We wanted it, our approach was, how do we, give this to the city? How do we provide the Wi-Fi? How do we grab all this data? How do we, give this wayfinding? How do we do this all for free? And it came back to, it's that value that Facebook has for each of us. It's the value that Google has for every single one of us. How do we provide enough value to every single citizen? And then what we found, and success comes from advertisement. 85% of Google's revenue is advertisement. Largest companies in the world. Facebook, 98% is advertisement. If you can provide that value and sustain that long enough, there's huge opportunities in the world in creating brand awareness, marketing opportunities, and to me, that's the success, and that's what we strive for.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of years ago, we were able to deploy some of these Wi-Fi networks, for example, with marketing dollars as a branding initiative, right? So that money's gone, but I've been encouraged even recently where some of the cities have found funding and found grants to help deploy not really just Wi-Fi, but to get to, and it's really happened recently to start to look at helping us in funding a fiber build where we may not have thought about that even a year ago. So subsidized means of any kind would certainly accelerate these builds. But, I think Jamie always puts it more elegant than I do about friendly approaches, which I would say on the advocacy side, it's very difficult because there are laws, there are rules that may keep you from going at the pace that you may want to go, right? So, but at any rate, I think I've been encouraged recently that there is a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel where they would share in the cost.
Can I ask a question? Rob, you mentioned the Wi-Fi, and how is Cincinnati Bell getting a return on that investment? Those are hard to operate and they're expensive, and I'm just curious about that because I'd love to see Wi-Fi in just about every city, ubiquitously deployed.
Well, from a telco perspective, if you look around anywhere, it's almost become table stakes. So for us, we had to bring something to the table, right? Because our consumers and business customers want access to Wi-Fi outside of the home. And so, as I said, it was initially a marketing initiative for a branding exercise, and that funded the app that we built, and that funded probably the first couple of hundred or so venues, APs that we deployed. And again, just to be clear, we've deployed them venue specific, right? We haven't blanketed the streets, right? The pockets aren't deep enough for something like that. So we focused on Riverbend or Newport Levee or the Aquarium, BB&T Arena.
Fountain Square.
And we've just, but to answer your question, of more recent, in the past year, Mike Grogan on my team the organization split a bit, but Mike has been instrumental in going out and creating deals that actually generate revenue. So our thought was to get a foothold, get a beachhead where we have victories that we've deployed this ecosystem, and then that other folks would follow in wanting to be part of it. And we do subsidize some of that, but it does not and will not in the near future produce a huge return on investment other than the brand. And that's kind of what we've looked at. Whether we don't have the advertising per se that Russ talks about, but for us, it's a branding initiative. And these are all fed with gig fiber circuits. So in essence, you can try our broadband before you buy it.
I just want to say too, with what Cincinnati Bell is doing, I know it's tough sometimes when you're not seeing those hard dollars and that ROI, but from everything that being a big part of the initiative and doing what we did in Newport, what I've seen is the fact that when you're exactly what you just said there at the end, when people are getting out there and they're experiencing this very fast internet, right, on the streets, that inclines them to go home and say, okay, well, you know what, now I want Cincinnati Bell over any of the other competitors. So now you're seeing almost every ISP is trying to find some ways, whether it's Time Warner doing in the restaurants, but you have to be one of their customers. Sorry, Spectrum now or Charter, wherever they are these days. I'm not even sure. But no, it's the fact that people are experiencing this out there in the wild, right? And then they're wanting to go home and use the same service. So I think that's huge to what you guys have done, and that's been big.
Yeah, and it's been tough to say how many paying customers did we acquire because we built a Wi-Fi network, or how many customers didn't churn. Typically in the telco or the wireless business, churn's one of the bigger drivers. But you look at Comcast and Charter in their deployment of the MVNO business. They've built the Wi-Fi networks that will now become a natural offload, so they aren't paying Verizon for the data, right? And so maybe down the road that's something we look at. But today we're settling on continuing down the path of giving customers and non-customers that type of experience. But the CFO asks me that probably every month. What's our return?
So Wi-Fi is no stranger to smart city conversations, but the connectivity that we talk about runs much deeper. Have you seen successful deployments in looking through the lens of smart cities, domestically or abroad, that have deployed mesh networks that are seamless and interoperable and functional?
I have not.
You wouldn't consider Copenhagen an example?
I've been there.
So the reason I ask this question, and I'm asked often, where is the smartest city, or where have you seen the best smart city deployed? And I struggle to answer because I think that we have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of ground to make up for. And by creating an environment in which we can give the government stakeholders the tools to make their decisions in representing the interests of their stakeholders, they know that they need to provide connectivity, but they don't understand what is necessarily required to make that happen. So there's a knowledge gap that I think needs to be solved for. How do we address that, and how do we do it in a way that's timely so technology doesn't continue to outpace policy?
It's just not another easy question.
Yeah, we've had some good ones. Look, policies and the law in this area is always going to lag behind the technology. It's been going on forever. We're still, operating most of the FCC on, I think, the 1934 Telecommunications Act. And they regulated the internet by bootstrapping some kind of phone idea. So it's always going to be behind. I don't think there's a way to get ahead of it. It just because these entrepreneurs and these inventors and they're coming up with so much so fast, and that by the time the people who make the laws, who don't really understand the technologies, get around to working on it, it's years later. And the policy people, maybe they're a little quicker, but it's always going to lag. It's something I've just kind of given up on, worrying about.
Yeah, I mean, it's the scariest thing out there, really, to me, is that and maybe this is just my view of it for what it's worth, but in this supposed greenfield of smart city that's ahead of us. There are companies coming up left and right in the past 12 to 18 months that really haven't sold a product yet. And so these I feel bad for these municipalities and universities that just get barraged with all of these potential solutions. And they may not have, I mean, most of us in this room we do this every day, right? Or we're around it most of the time. They may not have that expertise, so it makes it even more complicated. And to think that they're going to get around to that, they've got bigger problems to worry about. So until you can point at that problem and solve it, it's hard to get an audience.
So legislation aside, what is the largest challenge in deploying interoperable connectivity solutions in our places?
I mean, going back to where we're at today, I believe it's really that standard. And I think it's a testament to everybody that's here today, and it's a testament to USAC and what Venture Smarter is all about is creating this group of people, that are very passionate about technology, understand technology. They've been in it, for years, coming together and creating that, cohesive atmosphere that everything can translate and work together, right? Because that's really when we talk about being connected, it's a way to translate everything, and I think that's where we're at today. So again, hats off to you for what you've been able to accomplish in the two that you've got, and I just want to make sure I gave you a little bit of a shout out.
I appreciate that.
So.
Largest challenge.
I think it's a process with the groundswell of the industry that's created around smart city technology, and that I think some cities got out there and tore down the silos of their data and have made it available. And as more and more cities adopt open data policies and open government policies, the technology will enable for people to go get that the data and start to create solutions that will make cities smarter. So right now we're at a point where you have to kind of rely on people who are willing to take risk. In 5 years, it's going to shift. I think that it's going to be a requirement, and it's going to be a part of everyday life for cities. To the solutions and the technology and the way they do business, it's all going to focus around that. So I think we're eventually going to get there, and it's whether some of those startups and that can survive, the long haul in terms of it becoming profitable. But today you're going to see the big brand names that are focused on it because it is a long cycle.
I think the biggest issue will be return on investment for companies in the space, and especially the companies providing connectivity for cities. If there is no return on investment, they're not going to do it. Now, from a city perspective, it's how you measure return, right? Return isn't necessarily money to a city. It's quality of life and a bunch of other factors in it. So, it's going to come down to ROI, either private or public.
So have a little fun here. What is the worst example of a smart city project or deployment you've seen?
I won't name the city. It was actually brilliantly conceived and executed, but it didn't turn out very well. Deployed Wi-Fi citywide way back, like 8 or 9 years ago, when the equipment wasn't very good.
AOL dial-up?
No, it was Cisco gear. Anybody at Cisco here? It was. It was early. It was way too early, and not only was there issues with some of the gear, but the persons that were operating it didn't really know how to operate it. Maybe it was more that than the gear. But in any event, the idea was really good. We were going to put the city would be the anchor tenant. A private company which won the RFP would operate the network. The city would use a percentage of the bandwidth on the network for city things, and then the company would monetize the other 75% of the bandwidth. It was like a nice idea. A, that the system didn't work right. B, they didn't operate it. And C, the business plan was just abysmal. There was no other revenue coming into them other than the 25%. So even though it looked good on paper and I thought it was going to really work, it just never panned out at all.
Yeah, so I think this is a good story about why it scares some cities off to do it. But we see a lot of focus on smart intersections and the technology that's going on there. But I've seen in a number of places where cities will invest in a major intersection, put the technology there, to the sensors and everything to help cars move through it, but they ignore the 2 or 3 street lights that are a half a mile or a quarter of a mile away from the major intersection, and it still creates a backup and a backlog. And I think that's what ultimately tends to scare a number of cities away from really getting out there and doing anything, because it's, hey, you got good intentions of doing something in one particular spot, but it can also create problems in other spots that you're not anticipating, and I think that's unfortunately a part of taking risk.
Yeah, I'll just go with another common mistake, and that's lots of times cities do a really good job of picking up how much a technology project's going to cost, but they don't really always look at what the overall maintenance and relying and continuous improvement.
Initial build versus long-term cost.
Right. You see this all the time in plenty of technology installments. So
hidden cost because of what? The data storage is expensive. The connectivity solutions.
Right. That's a perfect example. I mean, when we talk about police body cams, for example, we know that's a perfect example that great idea, let's do this. Do we realize what petabytes of data cost in AWS, right? It gets pretty expensive very fast, and then when we have legislation in there that says we need to keep it for 7 years, that becomes you actually do the math on that, you're going, oh my God, that's bad. So definitely it's looking at that long-term goal and making sure that they could stay as broad as possible, but also on the path. It's tough.
Well, I'll poke some fun at myself here. And I do work for the phone company, so I can't really say the name of the city or I'll get in a lot of trouble. But a few years ago, there was a city bordering Cincinnati proper that wanted to launch Wi-Fi on their main corridor. And at that time, we just sold our wireless business off, which is where I came from, our macro business. So I was thrust into this situation to deploy this Wi-Fi in this main street of this city. And to give you an idea how short a time it's been for me, I thought I was just going to roll down to that city's city hall and say, hey, we're just going to put these up on your light poles. Everybody's happy. And, you'll have Wi-Fi. And, well, of course, that didn't work. And then as I dug under it, I realized why nobody around Bell wanted to kind of touch it, because there was a little problem of about $280,000 to dig fiber up the street. And someone had promised that to this city a year or two prior to that, way before probably we should have. But that took probably another 8 months to really design and actually build properly. Not to mention that their streetscape project was already done, so they weren't happy to dig up any part of the block again. So that was, I'll throw myself under the bus there.
So that comes back to prioritizations. Had that municipality been planning, they should have been building out their roads with connectivity solutions in consideration. But it would have been early.
The conduit and things you don't think about, and how you're going to power the APs based on dusk to dawn light poles that would turn off at certain times. And if you're powering the APs off of that, things like Russ said that you kind of got to think about.
Right. So those are some not smart city success stories. Can you give examples other than Columbus of cities that have maybe taken an unconventional approach to deploying a foundational layer of connectivity? So we're familiar with these wired projects that are fiber backed, but I have seen several examples of P2P and point-to-multipoint solutions, even as far west as Colorado. Do you have any examples of some out-of-the-box connectivity solutions that you've seen, and what do you like about that, or what do you not like about that?
These tend to, the wireless solutions, which are coming into urban big time, but the ones I've seen have been rural. Coshocton County had a connectivity issue, and they inventoried their assets that were high. They had some towers they already owned. They then, brought in a company that won an RFP that operated point-to-point microwave, off the government-owned facilities. and that at least expanded broadband into portions of the county where it wasn't, and drove costs down. So yeah, I've seen that sort of thing.
Yeah, similar. We're trialing a few different technologies that are very similar to point-to-point, multi-point. The link frequency obviously is important, because if you use an unlicensed frequency, you maybe invite more interference versus the cost of buying a link frequency that you would sort of own, so to speak. But we've looked at that both in the urban core, and we're in the midst of using a non-line of sight point-to-point technology that would be probably better suited for the rural areas. But those are the type of things that we're looking at right now. As far as, and I think I mentioned it a little earlier, some of the unique ways that we've deployed or have been enabled to deploy is the school systems. I'm still, I should have mentioned it this morning, but I still couldn't believe what I heard. I went to see a principal last week in an area of Cincinnati that you would not have thought had a problem with the digital divide. But it just goes to show
somewhere between 16 and 22%.
Yeah, I would say 20 was the number that I was given, right? They are driving a school bus on alternating nights to neighborhoods that is broadcasting Wi-Fi for kids to do homework. I thought that was an ingenious way to overcome, but I just couldn't believe. I think we got to do better than that, right? But the school systems kind of, whether it's Cincinnati Public or Newport City Schools, that's kind of been the way that we've gotten creative. Look, it's no secret. It costs a lot of money to build fiber. But what we did with the help of Kelly Milton at Newport City Schools is approach the businesses and say, and they came together, again, collaboration. Would you sign up for our services if we spent $800,000 to dig up Monmouth and York? Right? So that's a unique example that took a lot of people on board and a lot of time, but I think we're down to the short strokes. Yeah.
From a large scale, I mean, what you see going on with the hurricanes and Google putting out that balloon, I mean, that's what, I live for, just being a pretty big nerd, seeing new technologies like that, right? It's exciting.
So all of that started, it was a State Department-backed initiative that was released through the World Bank, and it was the Global Broadband Initiative, and that formally, through that title, doesn't exist anymore, but it's really fun to see these private companies running with an idea that started at the federal level.
Yeah, we're doing things with drones now, turning drones into towers for connectivity in really rural areas and that. But one of the things I do when I sit down with cities that are 20, 30,000 people, and some have gotten off to a really good start, is to tell them build your own fiber. I mean, that might sound kind of crazy coming from a telecom, but the reality is that Rob and I, our companies are going to go where the money's at, and where some of those smaller communities that can't necessarily garner that attention, but they want to keep and they have to keep small business in business there in those communities. Building their own fiber network to get that reliable connectivity for those businesses is going to be critical, because once they start to build that initial fiber infrastructure, it's amazing how much everything else tends to fall into place and follow suit, and then it starts to attract more and more businesses and bigger businesses. So sometimes it takes a little grassroots efforts for some of these smaller communities to do it, because the big telcos aren't going to necessarily come there right away.
I've got one more real quick on the creative side too. Guy sitting down right over there, one of our engineers, he in Lawrenceburg about 4 months ago, we did just on the creative side, it's a Sonos speakers on every lamp pole to create that experience for everybody throughout the day. The mayor basically can, from an app on his phone, create music for the entire city of Lawrenceburg. So it's kind of just a cool project that we were able to do, and we did it with a point-to-point Wi-Fi solution. So it's pretty cool.
I can see that playing really well around the holiday season. So I think we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one more question to the group, and then if there are any questions in the audience, feel free. We haven't really talked that much today about things like ultra-narrowband or 5G, but I don't want to walk out of here without asking you experts the question: how far away from 5G success stories are we in our cities? And what is 5G going to entail?
Well, I'm going to blame Jamie since he works for AT&T. No, I'm kidding.
We all need a good scapegoat.
No, actually, they're on the forefront, honestly. I think, how far are we away? Well, my background's in the handset business. So when are the chipsets going to be plentiful enough to support the different bands and 600 meg or others that, and how many can you stack in there, and when will they be available in a Samsung or an iPhone device? So to me, that's kind of where I start. So 5G is going to continue to build. There are more nodes, you know, more traffic can be handled, faster speeds. It goes back to, again, it's still wire in the ground feeding called backhaul, right? But I think the chipsets that have to catch up with that and make it more mainstream, at least in my opinion, 2019, when that becomes more commonplace on devices across the board, not just mobile phones.
Actually, we're seeing success stories. If anybody gets up to Fishers, Indiana, there's small cell technology deployed there. You're seeing gigabit speeds on your devices. Cincinnati, actually, I think we're probably deploying later on in the next couple of months. Should have some sites deployed relatively quickly. Kentucky will see some build out probably in 2018. A lot of that will follow some of the FirstNet technology and that's being built out with additional sites. So to Rob's point, I think you'll see larger scale success in the next 2 years, but you'll see pockets of success certainly in the NFL cities sooner than that.
Awesome. Are there any questions from the audience before we wrap up about smart and connected solutions in our cities? No questions. Okay. Panelists, thank you for joining us. That was good.
Thank you.